cards slapped against scarred pine, whiskey spilled, soaking into sawdust and compacted dirt. Amos didn't look at the money. He stared at the shivering girl tethered to the chair, collarbone sharp under bruised skin. He held 3 kings. The drifter held nothing. Amos pushed his heavy pelts forward. I call. The mining camp of Blackwood Creek, no, let's call it Iron Ridge, was a wound in the earth, all churned mud, stump-pocked hillsides, and canvas tents snapping in the bitter wind. Amos Thatcher had not intended to stay. He was a man of the high country, a solitary trapper who only descended when the snowmelt forced his hand, or when his supplies of lead, powder, and coffee ran down to dust. He had come into the assayer's office early that morning, dropped 60 pounds of prime, winter-caught beaver pelts on the counter, and taken his coin. By noon, he wanted to be gone. The air down here felt heavy, thick with the smell of unwashed men, wood rot, and raw desperation. But the snow had started falling around noon, thick, wet flakes that turned the main thoroughfare into a churning trench of brown slurry. Seeking temporary shelter, Amos stepped into the nearest saloon, a cavernous, drafty structure of rough-hewn boards known simply as the Northern. He took a table in the back corner. He did not drink to get drunk. He nursed a single glass of rye, letting the burn anchor him after 6 months of speaking to nothing but the wind and the mules. His hands rested on the table, hands that were broad, scarred white across the knuckles from a trap jaw snapping shut, ingrained with dirt and the slick lanolin of animal fat that never quite washed away. His eyes, pale and guarded under the brim of a weathered felt hat, tracked the room with the casual, ceaseless vigilance of a man accustomed to being hunted. The poker game at the center table had been going on for hours. 5 men, then 4, then 3. Finally, it was down to 2. Amos watched them from his peripheral vision. One was a professional, a riverboat exile in a frayed broadcloth coat. The other was a drifter who went by the name Hiram, a heavy, sweating man with frantic eyes and a jawline hidden under a patchy, grease-stained beard. Hiram was losing. He had lost his coin, his pocket watch, and the deed to a worthless silver claim up near the summit. Amos intended to finish his rye and walk out into the snow. But Hiram, stripped of his dignity and his capital, slammed both fists onto the table and shouted for the bartender to wait. He shoved back his chair, bolted out the swinging doors, and returned 3 minutes later, dragging something by the wrist. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 19, though the grime on her face and the hollows of her cheeks made her age difficult to parse. She wore a wool coat 3 sizes too large, the hem caked in frozen mud, and a faded calico dress that offered 0 protection against the high country winter. She did not scream. She did not fight. She stumbled when Hiram yanked her forward, catching herself on the edge of the poker table. Her eyes were fixed on the floorboards, flat and deadened. "My brother's girl," Hiram gasped, out of breath, pointing a thick finger at her. "He died of the ague in Denver. Left me his debts. She works. She cooks. She's strong." He looked at the professional gambler. "I value her at $50. Against the pot." The room went entirely silent. The clinking of glasses stopped. Men turned in their chairs. It wasn't morality that quieted them. It was the raw, ugly breach of protocol. You could wager gold, horses, even a rifle. But flesh brought a heavy, unpredictable energy to a room. The riverboat gambler leaned back, tapping a cigar against his chin. He looked at the girl with a mild, clinical distaste. "I have no use for a scullery maid, Hiram, and I don't trade in human livestock. She's collateral," Hiram barked, spit flying from his lips. "I win this hand. I take it all back." Amos watched the girl. He watched the way her shoulders hitched, barely perceptible, betraying the deep, rattling cold in her bones. He saw the purple bruising around her wrists where the man had dragged her. He had seen injured animals caught in steel jaws with that exact look in their eyes, a complete numb resignation to the butcher's knife. Amos stood up. The scraping of his chair against the floorboards sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He walked to the table. He didn't ask for permission to join. He simply pulled out an empty chair, sat down, and unbuttoned his heavy buffalo hide coat. He reached into his canvas sack and pulled out the heavy roll of greenbacks and gold eagles he had just traded his winter's labor for. He set it on the scarred pine. "Deal me in," Amos said. His voice was like gravel crushed under a wagon wheel, low, rough, and entirely devoid of inflection. Hiram blinked, sweating profusely. "You buying in?" "I am." Amos didn't look at the girl. "Deal." The riverboat gambler, sensing the shift in the room's gravity, folded his cards and slid away from the table, taking his winnings from the previous hands. "Your funeral, mountain man." It was just Amos and Hiram, a single hand of 5-card draw. Amos was dealt his cards. He picked them up with thick, calloused fingers. 2 kings, a 7, a 4, and a jack. Hiram was breathing heavily through his nose, his eyes darting between his cards and the pile of money Amos had laid down. "I need 3, Hiram said. The bartender, acting as dealer, tossed him 3 cards. "I'll take 1, Amos said, discarding the 4. He flipped the new card with his thumb. The king of spades. 3 kings. Hiram stared at his hand, a manic grin breaking through his beard. He pushed the girl forward by her shoulder. She stumbled, her hands gripping the back of the empty chair to steady herself. "I bet the girl," Hiram said, "and the $50 she represents." That was the moment. Cards slapped against scarred pine, whiskey spilled, soaking into sawdust and compacted dirt. Amos didn't look at the money. He stared at the shivering girl tethered to the chair, collarbone sharp under bruised skin. He held 3 kings. The drifter held nothing. Amos pushed his heavy pelts forward. "I call." Hiram slammed his cards down. 2 pair, aces and 8s. Amos didn't say a word. He laid out his kings, one by one. The silence in the saloon stretched out, heavy and suffocating. Hiram stared at the cards, his face draining of color. He looked from the kings to Amos, then to the money. He opened his mouth to argue, to claim a misdeal, but he met Amos's eyes. There was nothing in the mountain man's stare but cold, flat certainty, a promise of violence so absolute it required no words. Hiram backed away, leaving the girl standing by the table. He turned and bolted through the saloon doors, disappearing into the blinding snow. Amos slowly gathered his winnings. He shoved the money back into his canvas sack. He stood, buttoning his heavy coat, picked up his rifle, a massive Sharps .50 caliber that looked entirely natural in his grip. Finally, he turned to the girl. Her name was Hester. He didn't know that yet. All he knew was that she was standing perfectly still, waiting to be told what to do, who to follow, how to serve. Amos adjusted the strap of his pack. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded once, a jerky, mechanical motion. "Then walk." Amos turned toward the door. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He knew she would. She had nowhere else to go. The trail out of Iron Ridge was less a road and more a suggestion of a path, climbing aggressively upward into the timberline. The storm had broken, leaving behind a piercing, brilliant cold that seemed to freeze the moisture in Amos's lungs. The sky was an unforgiving, cloudless blue. Amos walked point, breaking trail through shin-deep snow. He maintained a steady, grinding pace, his long legs eating up the distance. He carried his rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgeline, reading the snow for tracks, reading the wind for the scent of wood smoke or predators. 20 paces behind him walked Hester. He had not asked her name, he had not offered his. When they left the saloon, he had marched her to the mercantile, bought a pair of wool trousers, a heavy canvas coat, thick woolen socks, and a pair of men's leather boots a size too small for him, but likely too large for her. He had paid the clerk, dropped the bundle in her arms, and pointed to the back room. When she emerged, swallowed by the stiff, oversized clothing, He handed her a pair of fleece-lined mittens. No words were exchanged. Now, hours into the ascent, the sheer brutality of the mountain was beginning to take its toll. The air was thinning. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. Amos paused at a switchback, leaning on his rifle, and looked back. Hester was struggling. The boots were clumsy on her feet. She was post-holing through the snow, her breath coming in ragged white plumes. She fell. Her knee struck a jagged piece of granite hidden beneath the powder. She went down hard, her hands sinking into the freezing snow. Amos watched her. He did not rush back. He did not call out to see if she was unhurt. He simply stood, a monument of hide and canvas, waiting to see what she would do. For 10 long seconds she didn't move. She just knelt there in the snow. Then, slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up. She dusted the snow from her knees, set her jaw, and took another step forward. She didn't look up at him. She didn't ask for a rest. Amos turned and continued walking, but he slowed his pace, just a fraction, just enough. They walked until the sun dropped behind the jagged peaks, casting the eastern slopes into deep violet shadow. The temperature plummeted instantly. A creek running beneath a thick sheet of ice echoed through the canyon, a hollow, rhythmic thrumming. Amos stopped in a grove of ancient lodgepole pines. He unslung his pack. "We camp here," he said. It was the first time he had spoken in 5 hours. Hester stood near the edge of the trees, her arms wrapped tightly around her torso, shivering violently. She watched as Amos efficiently cleared a patch of snow down to the bare earth. He gathered dead lower branches from the pines, arranged them with practiced precision, and struck a sulfur match. Within minutes, the small, intensely hot fire was burning. Amos laid out his heavy canvas tarp and a thick bedroll of wolf and bear skins. He dug into his pack, pulled out a blackened tin coffee pot, filled it with snow, and set it near the heat. He tossed a chunk of salted venison into a small skillet. When the meat was seared and the snow melt was boiling, he poured the water into a tin cup, dropped a pinch of bitter coffee grounds into it, and held it out. Hester hesitated. She took a step forward, reaching out with hands that trembled so badly. She nearly dropped the cup. She wrapped her fingers around the hot tin, letting the heat seep into her skin. "Sit," Amos said, gesturing to a downed log near the fire. She sat. Amos handed her the skillet with the meat and a heavy iron fork. He pulled a piece of hardtack from his pocket and began to chew it, watching the fire. "My name is Hester," she said. Her voice was raspy, unused, but it held a surprising steadiness. Amos chewed, swallowed. Amos. He didn't ask about her uncle. He didn't ask about Denver, or how she came to be wagered in a saloon. The mountain did not care about the past. Up here, history was just extra weight in a pack. "I don't know how to trap," Hester said quietly, looking down at the venison. "But I can cook, I can mend, I won't be a burden." Amos looked at her, really looked at her. Beneath the dirt, the bruising, and the exhaustion, he saw a stark, terrifying will to live. She wasn't asking for pity. She was negotiating her survival. She was proving her worth to the man who held her deed. "You aren't a slave," Amos said. His voice was flat, devoid of sentiment. "I bought you because that man was going to sell you to a crib down in the mud. Up here you do your share of the work. You eat your share of the food. When the pass clears in the spring, if you want to go back to the flatlands, I'll take you. Until then, you do what I say so you don't freeze to death." Hester looked up at him. Her guarded eyes met his. She nodded once. She picked up the fork and began to eat. They reached his cabin the next afternoon. It sat at 8,000 feet, tucked beneath a granite overhang that protected it from the worst of the avalanches. It was a brutal, ugly structure. Logs chinked with mud and horsehair, a sod roof heavy with snow, a single small window made of oiled paper rather than glass. Amos unlocked the heavy timber door. The inside smelled of old wood smoke, dried sage, and cured hides. It was freezing, darker than the outside, and entirely devoid of comfort. A single cast-iron stove sat in the center. A rough wooden table, one chair, and a single bed frame built into the wall, strung with rawhide. Amos walked in, dropped his pack, and immediately went to the stove to build a fire. Hester stood in the doorway, looking at the small space. It was 10 feet by 12 feet. There was nowhere to hide. Amos got the fire going. The iron pinged and cracked as it heated. He turned around and saw her looking at the single bed. He walked past her, grabbed a heavy stack of cured elk hides from a corner shelf, and threw them onto the floor on the opposite side of the stove. "You take the bed," Amos said. He didn't wait for her to argue. He walked out the door to fetch firewood. Winter in the Absaroka Range did not merely arrive. It fell like a guillotine. Within a week of their arrival, a storm dropped 3 feet of snow, locking them into the canyon. The world shrank to the interior of the cabin and the immediate 100 yards surrounding it. They existed in a choreographed silence. 10 by 12 feet of space meant they had to learn the exact dimensions of each other's movements. When Amos stood up to stoke the stove, Hester shifted her chair toward the wall. When Hester was at the small wash basin, Amos remained seated, oiling his traps. They did not collide. They did not apologize. They adapted. Amos was a man built of habit. He rose before dawn. He made coffee. He put on his snowshoes and went out into the blinding white to check his snare lines, returning mid-afternoon. Hester, true to her word, found her utility. Without being asked, she took over the maintenance of their survival. When Amos returned, his heavy wool socks were washed and hung near the stove. The venison was not just seared, but stewed with dried roots she had found in his stores. She found his bone needle and sinew thread and began reinforcing the worn seams of his canvas gear. She did not sing while she worked. She did not smile. She operated with a grim, methodical efficiency that Amos recognized because it mirrored his own. One afternoon in late January, the temperature rose just enough to make the snow wet and heavy. Amos returned from his trap line, dragging the carcass of a young mule deer. He hoisted it onto a thick oak branch outside the cabin door, the rope biting into his hands. He drew his skinning knife, testing the edge with his thumb. The cold made his fingers stiff. He made the first cut down the deer's belly. The steam rose off the carcass, thick and metallic, carrying the sharp scent of blood and pine needles. Amos worked quickly, peeling the hide back, but the animal was heavy and shifting on the rope. Suddenly a pair of hands appeared beside his, small, red from the cold, but steady. Hester took hold of the hide, gripping the slippery membrane, and pulled it taut, exposing the connective tissue so Amos could make a cleaner cut. Amos stopped. He looked at her hands, then up at her face. She was wearing her oversized capote, a wool scarf wrapped tight across her nose and mouth. Only her eyes were visible. They were focused entirely on the task. He didn't tell her to go back inside. He nodded. They worked together in silence. She anticipated his movements, pulling the hide back exactly when he needed tension, stepping out of the way when he needed to leverage his weight against the bone. When they reached the chest cavity, their hands brushed. Her skin was freezing, slick with blood. Amos felt a sudden, strange jolt at the contact, a stark reminder of another human heartbeat in a place that had been entirely his own for a decade. He pulled his hand back quickly, focusing intently on separating the ribs. When the meat was quartered and hung in the freezing cache, Amos walked to the creek to wash his hands in the icy water. Hester followed. They knelt side by side, scrubbing the blood from their skin with coarse sand. "You've butchered before," Amos said, not looking at her. "Pigs," Hester replied, her breath pluming. "When my father was alive, we had a farm in Ohio." It was the first piece of her past she had offered. Amos absorbed it, cataloging the information. Ohio, a farm, a father who was alive, which meant he was now dead. He stood up, drying his hands on his trousers. "The wolves will smell the offal," he said. They might come close tonight. Hester stood, looking out to the darkening timber. She didn't look frightened. She just looked tired. "Let them come," she said. That evening, after they had eaten in their usual silence, Amos did something he had never done. He took his backup rifle. A lever action. Winchester, down the barrel, loaded it with 5 heavy rounds, and set it leaning against the wall near the head of Hester's bed. Hester was sitting by the stove, mending a tear in his canvas sack. She stopped stitching. She looked at the rifle, then at Amos. "I check the upper traps tomorrow," Amos said, keeping his back to her as he arranged his snowshoes near the door. "I'll be gone till dark. If you hear something outside that isn't the wind, don't open the door. Just shoot through it." Hester looked at the heavy wood of the stock, the blued steel of the barrel. It wasn't just a weapon. It was an admission of trust. It was an acknowledgment that she was capable of holding her own ground. "I understand," she said softly. The next day Amos climbed the high ridge. The wind was brutal, howling through the granite spires, whipping the snow into blinding vortexes. He checked his snares, reset a trap that a wolverine had tripped and abandoned, and began the long descent. He was 2 miles from the cabin when he saw the tracks. Mountain lion, large. The paw prints were fresh, sinking deep into the powder, and they were heading straight down the draw, following the scent of the butchered deer. Amos felt a cold spike of adrenaline that had nothing to do with the weather. He dropped pack, leaving the heavy pelts in the snow, and began to run. He moved with reckless speed, his snowshoes clattering against hidden rocks, his breath tearing through his throat. He reached the tree line above the cabin just as the sun was setting. The cabin sat in the blue shadows. The deer meat was still hanging in the cache, and lying in the snow 20 yards from the front door was the mountain lion. It was dead. A massive pool of crimson was freezing into the white powder beneath its ribs. Amos walked slowly down the slope, his rifle raised, but the animal was completely still. He looked at the entry wound, a clean, devastating strike straight through the lungs from a heavy caliber bullet. He looked up at the cabin. The door was closed, but through the small oiled paper window, he could see the faint orange glow of the stove fire. Amos walked to the door and pushed it open. Hester was standing in the center of the room. The heavy Winchester was still in her hands. The smell of burnt powder hung thick in the confined space of the cabin. Her face was pale, and her shoulder was clearly bruised beneath the canvas coat from the brutal recoil of the weapon. But her eyes were remarkably calm. She looked at Amos. She lowered the barrel toward the floorboards. "It was trying to pull down the meat," she said. Her voice didn't shake. Amos looked at her. He looked at the rifle in her hands, at the steady line of her jaw. The image of the shivering, broken girl in the saloon seemed to belong to another lifetime. In her place stood a woman forged by the cold, awakened dangerous. Amos closed the heavy timber door behind him, shutting out the wind. He took off his hat and knocked the snow from the brim. "Good shot," Amos said. It was the closest thing to a compliment he knew how to give. Hester recognized it for what it was. A small, almost imperceptible softening occurred around the corners of her eyes. She turned, set the rifle carefully back against the wall, and walked to the stove to pour him a cup of coffee. The embers are fading to white, but this story is not finished. Humans have always gathered around the flames to hear what happens next. If you want to return to this camp, leave a like, share the tale, and subscribe to keep your place by the hearth. The winter trail gets much steeper from here. I will be waiting in this exact spot to tell you the rest of it. Keep the wind at your back until we meet again. The thaw did not arrive with warmth. It arrived with noise. In late April, the silence of the high country shattered. The frozen creek at the bottom of the draw cracked with a sound like cannon fire. Mud loosened from the granite ridges, sending cascades of wet earth and boulders crashing through the timber. The dripping of water from the cabin's sawed roof became a relentless percussive rhythm against the packed dirt outside the door. Amos began to prepare the winter's yield. He moved the heavy bundles out into the pale spring sunlight to inspect them for mold or insect damage. He knelt in the slush, brushing the thick fur, sorting them by grade and size. Hester sat on the chopping block near the woodpile, watching him. She held a sharpening stone in one hand, and Amos's heavy skinning knife in the other, drawing the steel across the stone with a rhythmic, metallic rasp. Amos pulled a piece of charcoal and a torn flap of canvas from his pocket. He flattened the canvas against his thigh and began to tally their winter labor. He was not a man given to optimism, but the numbers were undeniable. The winter had been hard, but the isolation had kept other trappers out of his territory. He folded the canvas and slid it back into his coat. "It's enough," Amos said, looking toward the pass, which was finally beginning to show the dark gray of exposed rock beneath the snowpack. "Enough to buy a stake down in the valley. Enough for a stagecoach ticket to wherever you want to go." Hester stopped the sharpening stone. She tested the blade's edge against the callous pad of her thumb. It drew a microscopic line of red. She wiped it on her trousers. "The pass is clear enough to walk?" she asked. "For the mules," Amos said. "We leave tomorrow." Chite. That evening the cabin felt smaller than it had during the deepest blizzards of January. The unspoken reality of their arrangement hung thick in the air, heavier than the wood smoke from the iron stove. Amos had promised to take her back when the snow cleared. Amos was a man who did exactly what he said he would do. He began to pack the canvas panniers for the mules. He worked methodically, stripping the cabin of the provisions required for the 3-day descent. 50 pounds of salt-cured elk meat, wrapped in waxed canvas. The heavy wolfskin bedrolls, beaten free of dust and rolled tight. 2 cast-iron skillets and the blackened coffee tin. The Winchester rifle, cleaned, oiled, and wrapped in a dry blanket. The remaining flour and hardtack sealed against the spring damp. Hester stood by the stove. She did not help him pack. She watched his broad back as he moved between the shelves and the panniers. For 6 months they had moved in a synchronized dance of survival. Now the rhythm was broken. He was preparing for an ending. "I don't have family in Ohio anymore," Hester said to his back. Amos paused, his hand resting on a sack of flour. "You have your share of the pelts. You earned them. Half the beaver and the marten. It's enough to set up in a boarding house. Learn a trade in Denver or Cheyenne." "A trade," she repeated, the word sounding hollow in the timbered room. "You aren't meant to die up here," Amos said roughly, turning to face her. "It's no life for a woman. It's mud and blood and freezing in the dark." "It's better than being collateral on a poker table," Hester said. Her voice was low, but it possessed a tensile strength that hadn't been there in November. She walked over to the panniers. She reached into the canvas bag and pulled out the Winchester rifle. Amos stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Put that back." "You gave me this rifle when the wolf tracks got too close," Hester said, holding the heavy weapon across her chest, entirely comfortable with its weight. "You didn't ask if I was a woman then. You asked if I could shoot. That was survival." "This is survival," Hester countered, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce heat. "Down there in the mud, men like Hiram decide what I am worth. Down there, I am a $50 chip. Up here, I am the one who shot the cat that tried to take our winter meat. Up here, I patched the holes in your boots so you didn't lose your toes to frostbite. I am not going back to a world where my value is assigned by strangers in a saloon." Amos looked at her. The bruised, hollowed-out girl was entirely gone. The woman standing before him smelled of wood smoke and pine resin. Her hands were rough, her skin tanned by wind and sun glare off the snow. A man does not buy a partner, Amos had once heard an old Shoshone trader say. A partner is forged in the fire you both build to keep from freezing. Amos looked at the unpacked panniers. He looked at the heavy timber door. Then he reached out and took the rifle from her hands. He didn't pack it away. He walked over to the wall and leaned it against the logs, right next to her bed. He didn't say a word. He simply turned back to the panniers, pulled out the heavy sack of flour, and placed it back on the shelf. Then he took out the skillets. Hester watched him unpack the mule's gear. Her shoulders, rigid with tension, slowly dropped. She walked over to the stove, picked up the iron poker, and stoked the embers. They did not down the mountain the next day. They did not go down the mountain for a very long time. 20 years is enough time to grind a mountain down by inches. It is more than enough time to change the shape of a frontier. The mud-churned mining camp of Iron Ridge had calcified into a town of brick, glass, and milled lumber. The canvas tents were gone, replaced by 3-story hotels with cast-iron balconies. The assayer's office had expanded into the Iron Ridge First National Bank, complete with a vaulted safe and a polished mahogany counter. Behind that counter sat Thaddeus, the chief actuary and loan officer. He wore a starched collar and wire-rimmed spectacles, his fingers stained black with ink. He was currently bent over a heavy, leather-bound ledger, calculating the projected yield of a massive timber contract secured on the northern slopes of the Absaroka Range. The mathematics required to assess the continuous income stream of old-growth pine over a multi-decade harvesting cycle were complex, requiring Thaddeus to employ advanced actuarial calculus. He scribbled the formula onto a piece of scratch paper to determine the present value of the estate's ongoing timber rights. Thaddeus adjusted his spectacles, substituting the known variable of a guaranteed monthly lumber delivery against the region's steady 5% interest rate. The resulting figure was staggering. The estate held more liquid and projected wealth than the town's copper mine, and the owners of that estate were due to arrive today. Out on the street, the late summer sun beat down on the dusty thoroughfare. Sweeping the boardwalk in front of the saloon was an old man. His back was bowed, his left leg dragged from an old, poorly set fracture, and his face was a ruin of broken capillaries and deep, dirt-ingrained wrinkles. Hiram paused his sweeping, leaning heavily on the broom handle, coughing a wet, rattling cough. He watched the street traffic with bitter, rheumy eyes. He survived on the scraps the saloon keeper threw him, sweeping floors, emptying spittoons, sleeping in the livery stalls. He had long forgotten the silver claim he once held. He had long forgotten the poker games. The alcohol had washed away the sharp edges of his memory, leaving only a dull, persistent resentment against the world. The rhythmic, heavy crunch of matched hooves on gravel cut through the ambient noise of the town. A custom-built Abbott Downing buckboard wagon rolled down the center of the street. It wasn't flashy. There was no red paint or polished brass, but the wood was cured hickory. The suspension was iron-forged, and the 2 massive roan draft horses pulling it were prime, grain-fed beasts worth a small fortune. The man driving the wagon pulled back on the heavy leather reins, bringing the team to a halt in front of the First National Bank. Amos Thatcher stepped down. He moved slightly lower than he had 20 years ago. His hair, shoulder-length under a flat-brimmed Stetson, was iron gray. Deep lines tracked from the corners of his eyes and mouth, carved by decades of sun and wind. But his back was dead straight, and the massive Sharps rifle still sat comfortably in the leather scabbard by the driver's seat. He wore a coat of brushed canvas and boots of dark oiled leather. He turned and offered his hand to the woman sitting beside him. Hester took his hand and stepped down onto the boardwalk. She was striking, not with the soft, powdered beauty favored by the town wives, but with the sharp, commanding presence of a hawk. Her hair, streaked with silver, was pulled back tightly. She wore a tailored riding skirt of heavy wool, and a leather jacket fitted perfectly to her frame. When she moved, it was with absolute economic precision. No wasted energy, no hesitation. On her left hand, catching the harsh afternoon sun, was a simple, heavy band of hammered gold. It was thick, unadorned, and looked as though it had been beaten into shape on an anvil. A matching band rested on Amos's scarred left hand. They did not speak as they walked toward the bank doors. They didn't need to. 20 years of shared silence, of enduring winters that snapped trees in half, of fighting off fever and predators, had fused their instincts. Hiram stood frozen on the boardwalk, his broom forgotten. He stared at the man. He recognized the sheer, intimidating mass of him, the flat, guarded eyes that promised immediate violence if crossed. Then Hiram looked at the woman. His rheumy eyes widened. The broom slipped from his trembling hands and clattered against the wooden planks. He remembered the snow. He remembered the cards slapping against the scarred pine of a saloon table. He remembered $50. "It's them," Hiram whispered, his voice cracking, stumbling backward until his spine hit the clapboard siding of the saloon. Amos and Hester did not look at him. Hiram was a ghost, a pathetic remnant of a world they had conquered and left behind. They walked past him, their boots heavy on the boards, and pushed open the etched glass doors of the bank. Inside, the chatter of the lobby died instantly. Thaddeus stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He hurriedly closed the ledger and moved around the counter, offering a slightly nervous, obsequious smile. "Mr. Thatcher, Mrs. Thatcher," Thaddeus said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet room, "we have the timber deeds prepared for your signature, and the deposit from the cattle drive has been secured." Amos didn't look at the banker. He looked at Hester. Hester stepped forward. She unclasped her leather satchel and pulled out a heavy stack of signed manifests. She placed them on the mahogany counter. Her hands, resting on the polished wood, were not soft. They were calloused, strong, and deeply capable. "The lumber mill on the South Ridge is cutting short on their quotas." "Thaddeus," Hester said. Her voice was calm, clear, and carried the weight of absolute authority. "If they fall behind again next month, pull their lease. We'll run the saws ourselves." "Yes, ma'am. Of course, Mrs. Thatcher," Thaddeus stammered, quickly gathering the manifests. Amos stood a half step behind her, his hands resting loosely on his belt. He watched the perimeter of the room, still scanning for threats by habit, but his attention was tethered to her. When the paperwork was finished, Hester gave a single nod. They turned and walked out of the bank. By the time they reached the buckboard, half the town had stopped to watch. The whisper had started 20 years ago, tall tales spun by a riverboat gambler who claimed a mountain man had wagered a fortune in winter pelts against a starving girl. Nobody had entirely believed it. It was too brutal, too strange. But as the townspeople looked at the vast timber tracts owned by the Thatchers, the cattle that bore their brand, and the undeniable, ironclad partnership between the giant mountain man and his wife, the legend settled into hard, historical fact. Amos climbed into the driver's seat. Hester climbed in beside him. Amos picked up the reins. He didn't crack a whip. He simply clicked his tongue, and the massive roan horses leaned into the harness. The wagon wheels ground against the dirt, turning away from the brick and glass of Iron Ridge, heading back toward the steep timbered ascent of the high country. They left the town in their dust, two people forged in the ice, bound by a wager, and entirely unconquerable.